on behalf of all the historians here and our head of program, Associate Professor Catherine Gervasi, who sends her apologies this evening, it's a very great pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 Greg Denning Memorial Lecture. I'd like to commence the formal part of this evening's proceedings by acknowledging that we're meeting on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people and to pay respects to their elders past and present and their families. Now, before we move into the lecture, a little bit of housekeeping. A welcome to our guests online via Zoom. I hope you can hear me okay. And please do feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions at any time during the lecture or during the question time. Dr. Howes, our speaker this evening, will be speaking for roughly 45 minutes, followed by question time. And there'll be a closing vote of thanks from the Hanson Professor of History, Professor Mark Edler. But before I introduce the evening's lecturer more fully, Professor David Goodman has very kindly agreed to give a brief introduction to the lecture and the scholar it commemorates, Professor Greg Denning. David, over to you.
Thank you. So it just seemed to us appropriate at the Greg Denning lecture just to remind people who Greg Denning was. He graduated from this university in history with an honours degree in 1958. He went on to an MA in Pacific prehistory, supervised here by John Mulvaney. Later went on to the ANU to become probably the most famous Australian archaeologist of his generation. Probably something not widely known, that history here was teaching Pacific history and Pacific prehistory through the 1950s and early 60s. Greg went on from that to a PhD in anthropology at Harvard University, studying the Marquesas Islands, and a thesis which eventually, after quite a bit of transformation, became the book on the left there, Islands and Beaches, Discourse on a Silent Land, which came out, I think, in 1978, 79. He held positions at the University of Hawaii, Queensland, La Trobe University shortly after it opened, but returned here to Melbourne as Max Crawford Professor from 1971 to 1990. I've put up there probably 3 of his most well-known books and a photograph. He was very influential as a teacher. So one of the things about him is many of the books came quite late in the career, several of them after his retirement. His time here as a teacher was quite transformative for many of us who were fortunate enough to be taught by him. I've put up a reference there to what was really his inaugural professorial lecture, published in Historical Studies as History of the Social System. And I've put up a word cloud there, so you can see in a couple of seconds what it's about. It was about the discipline of history and its relationship to the neighbouring social and human sciences. He said in the article, there's broader recognition today, being the early 70s, broader recognition that knowledge in any form is a distortion of the wholeness and complexity of reality. And that was really the theme about how disciplines tunnel and shape knowledge, and calling for greater reflection about the way history did that. His innovative third-year subject, Social and Reflective History. I won't read it out, but the quote there from Tom Griffiths, who took the subject in 1977, as did I. We remember the way Greg transformed one of the old lecture theatres in this building, actually, into a ship, so that we could better understand the mutiny on the Bounty with tape on the floor and so on. He required us all to go and do ethnography of something in our own society and to reflect on the way history is a way of knowing and its relationship to other ways of knowing. I've self-indulgently put up here, this was our honours seminar in 1978, 6 students for the entire year. And Greg announced to us at the first session that we were going to write a book, which in fact we did, published several years later. In 1982, Greg employed me for a year as his research assistant, and I was in the archives earlier in the year and found this handwritten description of the project that we were working on, History in the Symbol Sciences. And there's the aims and justification. That never appeared as a book, but you can see that that thought informed so much else that he did. Greg retired from here in 1990s, spent a lot of time after that at the ANU, and most famously, with Don America's wife, pictured here, ran these PhD workshops called Challenges to Perform. And really it was the themes about thinking of history as something to be performed, thinking of history as something which required a great deal of imagination as well as hard work, really had, I think these PhD workshops spread his influence really on a national and international basis. The two of them did it for several years, also with Dipesh Chakrabarti, former colleague. So those are the sort of transformative themes I think we should remember Greg for, not just as a great historian of the Pacific, but as someone who really called on us to reimagine what history could be.
Thank you so much, David. Well, it's now my honour and privilege to introduce to you this year's Denning lecturer, Dr. Hilary Howes. Hilary is currently a research fellow in the Centre for Heritage and Museum Studies at the Australian National University. Dr. Howes is a graduate of this university, where she studied history, German and botany. And in fact, while searching the Baillieu catalogue today, I came across her honours and MA theses on the environmental history of the Merri Creek and the management of salinity in the Goulburn Valley, subjects that are perhaps a little too timely at present. Dr. Howes then went on to write her doctorate at the ANU, which was transformed into the 2013 monograph, The Race Question in Oceania, which I have here. It's a book which showcases Hilary's commitment to a symmetrical history of race in the Pacific, a history which seeks out Indigenous countersigns alongside dominant colonial and colonising discourses of race. Tracing the webs of communication and encounter which generated and destabilised theories of race in the period, the book is an example of Hilary's commitment to careful archival work alongside the ethical imperative of a history that seeks to listen for traces of resistance and Indigenous presence and agency. Beyond her monograph, numerous articles and book chapters, most recently, Hilary has co-edited a monumental 600-page collection uncovering Pacific pasts, histories of archaeology in Oceania, that appeared earlier this year. Dr. Howes's wide-ranging work on the collection of Indigenous remains by German anthropologists and archaeologists has informed her very significant later work in the diplomatic sphere. On the completion of her doctorate, she took up the post of executive assistant to the Australian ambassador in Berlin, during which time she was actively involved in the first repatriations of Australian Indigenous ancestral remains from German collections. Indeed, Hilary continues this double career as academic and diplomat. She's currently on leave from her fellowship at ANU to act as the Director of Science and Innovation for the German Embassy in Canberra. Hilary's current research project, Skulls for the Tsar, Indigenous Human Remains in Russian Collections, is funded by a prestigious ARC Discovery Early Career Researcher Award and aims to produce the first detailed investigation of the acquisition of Indigenous human remains from Australia, New Zealand and the broader Pacific by the Russian Empire during the long 19th century. We're honoured to hear some of the first fruits of that project this evening. Hilary's histories of the Pacific are marked by an immersion in the archives, careful attention to detail, humility and ethical care, and a literary style that allows their carefully crafted arguments to emerge with a gentle lucidity, their histories of imagination and solidarity. It's therefore a very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Hilary Howes to deliver the 2022 Greg Denning Memorial Lecture.
Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Matthew. I hardly recognise myself. I must meet this amazing person you've just introduced. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it. And I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we meet, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and paying my respects to their elders past and present, as well as extending those respects to any First Nations people who may be present today. And I think it's important to emphasise before I begin that my presentation touches on a confronting and distressing topic, the removal and scientific study of First Nations Australian ancestral remains, and that some of the terminology I quote would be considered offensive today and should be understood in its historical context. My presentation also includes artistic depictions of First Nations peoples, of anatomical preparations and of human remains, and I mention the names of a few First Nations people who have died. It's a great honour to be invited to give this year's Greg Denning Memorial Lecture. Sadly, I never knew Greg Denning personally, but my PhD supervisor, Professor Bronwyn Douglas, was a junior colleague of his at La Trobe University in the early 1970s. And she has acknowledged his influence on her work as an ethnohistorian. So I think there's an element of intellectual genealogy evident there. And David Goodman also showed the cover image of Greg Denning's first book based on his PhD thesis about the Marquesas, which is a very significant part of the Russian experience in the Pacific also. Now, I'll be talking to you today about Imperial Russia's scholarly interest in the physical and cultural diversity of Australian and Pacific peoples, drawing, as Matthew said, on my current DECRA project. And I'm undertaking this project in close collaboration with Dr. Yelena Gobor, whom I believe she is on Zoom. Lovely. Privyet, Yelena. She is a native Russian speaker and an expert on Russian voyages of exploration to Australia and the South Pacific. I'm also collaborating closely with the Return, Reconcile, Renew international team of leading Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers and repatriation practitioners under the leadership of Professor Cresta Ford. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of the structure, I'll start by giving you an introduction to Russian scholarly interest in the varieties of humankind and how it developed over time, followed by some insights into early Russian expeditions to the Pacific and their attempts to understand and communicate the human, physical and cultural diversity they encountered. I'll then look at the efforts made by two of Russia's major collecting institutions to acquire ancestral remains and material culture from Australia and the Pacific. First, the Peter the Great Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography in St. Petersburg, also known as the Kunstkamera, and second, the predecessor institutions of what is now the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography of Moscow State University. Now, Russian science from the 18th century onwards was very much an international venture. Geography, physical anthropology, and ethnography in the Russian Empire were entangled with the scientific and colonial endeavours of Western European nations. Two European languages, German and French, competed within Russian academia during this period. French was the language of culture of the middle and upper classes, while German predominated in technology and science. A number of Russian learned and academic societies published in-house journals in these languages rather than in Russian, including the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. And you see the first table of contents from their first volume here. And as you can see, it's very largely in French and German, with one article in Russian and a couple in Latin also. German was also the native language of a significant section of the population of the Russian Empire. These were Baltic Germans, the descendants of German traders and crusaders who began settling in the Eastern Baltic territories, which is essentially present-day Estonia and Latvia in this case, in the 12th and 13th centuries. They established themselves gradually in these areas as the social, commercial, political and cultural elite, with German as their official language of education and government. Here you see a brief outline of the process by which they were incorporated into the Russian Empire over the course of the 18th century. And after this had happened, Tsar Peter the Great and his successors guaranteed the Baltic Germans the freedom to speak their language, to practice their religion, and to retain their special laws and institutions, recognising that these concessions were necessary to ensure the goodwill and loyalty of educated, skilled and disciplined individuals who could serve Russia as professional officers and administrators. Baltic Germans were landed gentry and usually spoke both German and Russian fluently, giving them favourable opportunities in terms of higher education and employment, and enabling them to connect Russia, Germany and Western Europe more broadly via the Baltic territories. The Age of Enlightenment came to Russia bound up with German culture, which played an important role in the Europeanization of Russia since the times of Tsar Peter the Great. The study of Indigenous peoples in the outskirts of the expanding Russian Empire provided a vast field for the various new scientific approaches characteristic of the Age of Reason. One of these approaches was taxonomy, the systematic classification of living organisms. The proto-anthropological cataloguing of different peoples played an important part in this respect. For instance, in 1737, the Russian geographer Vasily Tatishchev, whom you see here on the right, compiled a detailed questionnaire for the purpose of categorising the world's peoples, including queries concerning their anthropological type, including body shape, hair and skin colour, type of nose, type of lips, as well as their origins and their language. The Great Northern Expedition of 1733 to 43 to Siberia and North America, also known as the Second Kamchatka Expedition, was comparable in scope to Captain Cook's voyages, although far less well known. It was conceived by Peter the Great and completely financed by the Russian state, but nevertheless the expedition members included a number of German-born scholars, including the historian, geographer and pioneer ethnographer Gerhard Müller. Expedition members used Tatishchev's questionnaire and Müller's ethnographical instructions to describe the peoples they encountered. From the standpoint of the Age of Reason, these expedition members saw the Indigenous people they encountered as representing earlier stages of human cultural development and were critical of many aspects of their otherness. Peter Simon Pallas, a German naturalist and a student of Linnaeus, was one of the first to examine biological aspects associated with the varieties of living creatures, although he did set humans apart from other living organisms. He headed the Second Grand Russian Expedition of 1768 to 1774, which consisted of several detachments sent to different areas of the Russian Empire to observe the transit of Venus, and that was the purpose also of James Cook's first voyage to the Pacific of 1768 to 71. Both expeditions accumulated significant quantities of anthropological materials during their travels. One of the participants in the Russian expedition, German-born naturalist Johann Gottlieb Georgi, published the first detailed taxonomy of the peoples inhabiting the Russian Empire over the years 1776 to 1780, using an historical linguistic approach to classify them. Really, these works laid the foundations of Russian scholarly interest in the varieties of humankind, and as I think I just mentioned, the fact that a variety of peoples lived within the territory of the expanding Russian Empire helped to encourage interest in comparative studies. Pallas's ideas were further developed by German comparative anatomist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach at the Georg August University in Göttingen. Blumenbach classified humankind into 5 principal races or national varieties: Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, American, and Malay, with the last category including Indigenous Australians and Pacific Islanders. He relied primarily on skull morphology, skull shape, to determine these races, arguing that the skull acted as the interpreter of the soul and combined stability with the utmost variety of shape and of the relative proportion of its parts. Blumenbach amassed large collections of human skulls from all over the world. His extensive networks of former students, fellow scientists, and other contacts included many scholars in the Russian Empire. Although academic studies in Russia in the late 18th and early 19th centuries generally did not actually use craniological materials for anthropological and racial research, Russian scholars were aware of Blumenbach's interest and actively supplied him with craniological materials from the territory of the Russian Empire. One such mediator was a Russian doctor of German origin, Georg Thomas von Asch, a native of St. Petersburg and graduate of Göttingen University. Plaster casts of some of the skulls sent to Blumenbach by Asch were later brought back to Russia, as it were, by Karl Ernst von Baer, a Baltic German anatomist and embryologist, and I'll talk about him in more detail shortly. Western European and especially German influences on Russian collecting practices were also evident in the Russian round-the-world expeditions or circumnavigational expeditions, which made numerous visits to Australia and the Pacific Islands during the first 3 decades of the 19th century. And I think also this is really not very well known in comparison to, say, Cook's voyages or some of the French explorers and navigators. For instance, the leader of the first Russian round-the-world expedition of 1803 to 06 on the ships Nadezhda and Neva, Adam Johann von Krusenstern, was a Baltic German. Most of the journals documenting the expedition were written in German, including those kept by the individuals whose names I've listed there. Like other major sea voyages of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the first Russian round-the-world expedition had multiple aims. These included naval aspirations to gain a foothold in the North Pacific, commercial visions, specifically the Russian-American company's desire to launch a sea connection with Russia's European ports and promote a direct fur trade with China, diplomatic ambitions, best illustrated by the late and controversial inclusion of a Russian embassy to Japan, so-called, in the expedition party, and exploratory and cultural tasks, including scientific observation and the acquisition of ethnographic specimens. Expedition participants were equipped with instructions encouraging them to gather information on the probable order in which the Pacific Islands were populated, what changes various tribes of people and species of animals have undergone, and whether it is true that some of them have become extinct. Although these instructions did not specifically mention the collection of skeletal remains, skull collecting quickly became one of the top priorities of the naturalists and officers aboard the ships. It was particularly intense during the expedition's 12-day visit to the island of Nukuhiva in the Marquesas Archipelago in 1804. Ornamented skulls, or ipu, which you can see to the left, carried by men, were among the most striking features of Nukuhivan attire. The scramble for these ornamented skulls led to tensions and disputes among expedition members, as you can see in the quote there, most of whom were collecting on behalf of personal contacts with an interest in science. The majority of these contacts, again, were German-speaking, born in either Germany or the Baltic territories of the Russian Empire, and in most cases professionally active in both the Russian Empire and Germany. Relatively few expedition members acquired skulls specifically for Russian institutions, but some of the naval officers did obtain skulls for the Imperial Russian Admiralty, and 2 expedition members each donated 1 skull to the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. Expedition members also enthusiastically collected artefacts during their stay on Nukuhiva. Like the ornamented skulls, these artefacts were considered the personal acquisitions of expedition participants, rather than elements of the voyage's official findings. As such, they typically remained in the hands of individual collectors. Some were gifted to state museums after the expedition's return, Others were presented to learned societies or scientific patrons, and others again remained for generations in private hands. Of over 200 artefacts collected, 130 can be identified today in museums in Russia, Ukraine, Estonia, Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. And really that is the result of Yelena Gogol's painstaking work, in particular in collaboration with Nicholas Thomas. A number of expedition members also attempted to communicate the physical and cultural diversity of Pacific peoples through publications. Some published articles in scientific journals, focusing on aspects of Nukuhiban culture which particularly provoked their interest, notably tattoos, practices, and cannibalism. Several also published books targeting the educated general public, describing their experiences and observations during the voyage and pairing these with illustrations depicting Nukuhiban landscapes, people, religious practices, and material culture, as for example, the one shown here. These patterns, namely the collection of human remains and artefacts and the publication of experiences and observations, were repeated in later voyages. For example, a Russian expedition to the South Pole in 1819 to 21, led by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev in the ships Vostok and Mirny, sailed with explicit instructions regarding anatomical studies. This expedition brought back several toimoko, preserved Maori heads, probably from Ship Cove on the South Island of New Zealand, visited in 1820. These toimoko entered various Russian collections, including the Admiralty Museum in St. Petersburg, the Kunstkamera in St. Petersburg, and the Zoological Cabinet of Kazan University, where expedition astronomer Ivan Simonov was based. Artefacts collected by Simonov during the expedition became the foundation stone of the Ethnographic Museum of Kazan University, while artefacts collected by Bellingshausen himself mostly found their way into the Kunstkamera, and some of them can actually be seen in this 2011 film, The Russians Are Coming, by Tara Productions, which is well worth a look if you have the opportunity. Moving on now to the Peter the Great Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography, also known as the Kunstkamera. It was established by Tsar Peter the Great in St. Petersburg in 1714, making it the first public museum in the whole of Russia. Like its counterparts in Western Europe, it was inaugurated with a collection of naturalia or natural objects, with a special interest in so-called freaks of nature, monsters, and curiosities. In 1717, Peter the Great purchased an extensive collection of anatomical specimens, embalmed animals, and dried plants from the Dutch botanist and anatomist Frederik Ruysch. In 1718, he decreed that any unusual skeletal remains or other curiosities found should be donated to the Kunstkamera. In 1724, the Kunstkamera was incorporated into the newly established Imperial Academy of Sciences, and this facilitated its transformation into a research institution, for which the collection of artificialia, meaning objects created or modified by humans, became increasingly important. In the mid-19th century, the Kunstkamera's craniological collection was restructured and significantly expanded. These changes were connected with a bequest from Georg Josef Keitsch, a German-born medical officer stationed with the Dutch armed forces in Batavia, now Jakarta, who had served as battalion surgeon in the Russian army from 1813 to 15. The collection comprised 12 skulls of orangutans and 83 skulls of different peoples from locations across South Asia and island Southeast Asia, mostly sourced from hospitals. Keitsch's bequest far exceeded the existing collection of the Academy of Sciences in number, and following its arrival, the Baltic German anatomist and embryologist Karl Ernst von Baer, whom you see here, was appointed director of the Academy's anatomical cabinet in 1842. He was motivated to organise and augment the craniological collection, partly by the realisation that scholars in the Russian Empire, in comparison to those in Western European nations, had only recognised what he described as the need for a plentiful collection of skulls of various nationalities for comparative purposes at a very late stage. And he gives us sort of a personal anecdote to illustrate this. In 1828, While attending a gathering of naturalists in Berlin, apparently he had been horrified to witness the Russian emperor's personal physician, Josef Riemann, presenting 35 skulls from Russia to the Berlin Anatomical Museum. And when Beer asked why they had not been kept in Russia, Riemann apparently replied, "No one cares about them there." So Beer was determined to change this. In addition to donations such as pictures, he purchased remains outright or utilised his influence as a member of the prestigious Academy of Sciences to encourage travellers to collect on his behalf. Occasionally, he collected skulls in person, for example, on a visit to Switzerland, where he describes plundering charnel houses until someone he considered a narrow-minded clergyman drove him away. In addition, he helped organise a collection of plaster casts of skulls, which could facilitate exchanges with other museums, drawing on his extensive scholarly network, including Blumenbach in Göttingen, whom I mentioned earlier, and the Swedish anatomist Anders Adolf Retzius. My colleague Jelena and I discovered recently that Beer was also responsible for commissioning a series of three-dimensional panels depicting what he described as types of national physiognomies from the 5 parts of the world. The panel you see here, titled Australia, is made from plaster and is currently held in the Kunstkammer. The Kunstkammer's collections online website attributes it to an artist by the name of Ivan Geisert and makes no mention of Beer. Information in Russian sources was scanty, but it did offer an alternative spelling of Geisert's surname without the T at the end, and it did connect him to Beer. Then Jelena discovered a digitised version of a book in an antiquarian bookshop in Melbourne containing photographs of very similar panels. And according to this book, the panels had been prepared for the Great London Exposition of 1862, a World's Fair, by a sculptor named J.M. Heuser. This led us to guess that Heuser and Geiser might be the same person. As you may have noticed from some of the individuals I've already mentioned, Baltic Germans in Russian service often had 2 sets of names, and the letter H was and still is often transliterated into Russian as G, as in the examples you see here. And maybe it's just my juvenile sense of humour, but I just love the idea of Harry Potter's little-known Russian cousin, Gary Potter. So searching for the name Heuser in online archives was enormously fruitful. We discovered digitised correspondence in German between Heuser and Beer, and proof positive that Heuser and Geiser were in fact the same person. We also discovered an article by Beer in the St. Petersburger Zeitung, a German language newspaper published in Russia. And I mean, the fact that there's a German language newspaper being published in Russia gives you some idea of how widely German was spoken in the Russian Empire. And this article described Beer's motivation in commissioning the panels of national physiognomies and also how they had been produced. He saw them as responding to a growing public interest in human physical and psychological diversity, and hoped they would provide students in secondary schools and universities with a foundation of knowledge of the variations of the human race, his words, and would enable educated adults to picture these variations instead of just reading about them. Significantly, he stressed that he had chosen to arrange the individual physiognomies on each panel geographically, with their placement from top to bottom and from left to right, corresponding to the relative location of their home countries from north to south and from west to east. He resisted arranging them according to any assumptions about how closely they were related to one another, because he believed that this would be arbitrary, and he noted that scholars from Linnaeus onward had reached very different conclusions on this point. Beer also mentioned that he had supplied Heuser with illustrations from existing publications as a basis for his 3-dimensional sculptures. And Jelena, again, has done a remarkable job of identifying many of these. Although some of the individuals, quite a few of the individuals depicted as national physiognomies were known by name, including these 2 that you see here, on the panel, they were anonymised as simply kings and queens, or more often male and female inhabitants of such and such a place. And scholars of human diversity at the time frequently employed the strategy of what Chris Ballard has called creating a general type from a known and named individual. There is one exception, which I also find very interesting, that is Kadu, a man from Walia in the Caroline Islands in present-day Micronesia, who spent 8 months with Otto von Kotzebue's yet another Russian round-the-world expedition on the Rurik in 1817, travelling to Bering Strait and to Hawaii before returning to the Caroline Islands. And Kotzebue and other expedition participants came to consider Kadu a friend and companion, and relied heavily on his ethnographical and geographical knowledge of what is now Micronesia. To wrap up this section of my talk, I'd just like to acknowledge that while artworks are interpretations of reality in themselves, they're also subject to further reinterpretations. And Heuser's national physiognomies, on the one hand, were reinterpretations of two-dimensional artworks, but they also experienced additional reinterpretations. And just to give you one example, if we compare the plaster panel in the Kunstkamera's collection to the paper mache panel produced for the Great London Exposition, which we believe to be the older version, perhaps the original version, we see that on the Kunstkamera's panel, the newer one, the female inhabitant of New Holland, meaning Australia, and the woman from Nukuhiva Island have just swapped places. And I suppose this suggests that the arbitrariness that Baer deplored in attempts to categorise human races, nevertheless crept into the anthropological depictions he commissioned. I'd now like to turn from St. Petersburg to Moscow as a second centre of anthropological studies in Russia. Initially, the activities of Moscow's natural science enthusiasts centred around the Imperial Moscow Society of Naturalists, established in 1805 at the Moscow University with a predominantly academic membership. This society published a journal over the years 1829 to 1917, initially in French and German, with contributions from naturalists from all over the world. Its members had a variety of contacts with naturalists in the Australian colonies during the first half of the 19th century and later, but from really from their inception, pretty much, and were exchanging botanical and zoological specimens, collections, and publications during this period. In the 1860s, a relatively liberal period in Russian history, a second learned society was established in Moscow. It was initially named the Society of Devotees of Natural Science, but soon expanded its scope and amended its name to become the Imperial Society of Devotees of Natural Science, Anthropology, and Ethnography. It was established with a broad membership and used the Russian language for its communications and publications. These two societies joined forces to champion the organisation of anthropological exhibitions as part of the 1867 All-Russia Ethnographical Exhibition in Moscow. Anatoly Bogdanov, a Russian zoologist and anthropologist, was particularly active in these endeavours. He was a founding member of the Society of Devotees and was eager to popularise physical anthropology and craniology. In 1867, he delivered a public lecture on its significance, arguing that, quote, the skulls of various tribes were the letters with which one can comprehend prehistoric man. He also believed that the ethnically and culturally diverse peoples of the Russian Empire were poorly known anthropologically, declaring, probably no one will argue with the fact that the public is more familiar with the main features of the tribes of Africa and Australia than with the tribes inhabiting Russia. It would be desirable, therefore, for the society to arrange anthropological and craniological collections accessible to the public and able to serve as a most instructive book. Another significant figure in Moscow at this time was Charles Renard, a German-born scholar of French heritage who studied in Germany but made his career in Russia. He was the secretary of the Society of Naturalists in the 1860s, and he was also curator of the ethnographic collection at the Moscow Public and Rumyantsev Museum, established in 1862. Renard was in contact with Baer, and through him with Heuser, from whom he commissioned a series of replicas of skulls in the collection of the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. But Renard also reached out to contacts beyond the borders of the Russian Empire to secure anthropological and ethnographic materials. One such contact was the German-Australian botanist, Ferdinand von Müller, who was instrumental to the establishment and advancement of botany in Australia, and is undoubtedly one of Australia's most prominent 19th century scientists. Müller was exceptionally well connected, with an extensive network of collectors throughout Australia and numerous contacts overseas. He had already engaged in exchanges with Russian visitors to Australia, including Dmitry Maltselov, surgeon aboard the Russian naval ship Svetlana, which visited Melbourne in January 1862. And I realise the topic of this lecture is a bit heavy in some respects, but I've tried to introduce a little bit of, lightheartedness, and I just love this sketch of, the captain of the Svetlana being escorted upstairs by a crowd of admirers. It's just, particularly in the current climate, it's just really nuts. Getting back to Müller, in 1866, Müller wrote to the Moscow Society of Naturalists, offering them 2 of his publications and a collection of Australian seeds, because as some of you may know, he was also very interested in acclimatisation and transporting plant and animal species to other parts of the world. Renard lost no time in proposing Müller as a member of the society, and he then wrote to Müller to inform him of his election to the society and immediately appealed to him for donations. We should be much obliged if you could supply us with natural history specimens and even ethnographic objects. The latter would be very appropriate just now, as an ethnographic exhibition will be held in Moscow during the spring of 1867, and it would, of course, be very desirable to see Australia represented too. In the already existing ethnographic section of the public museum here, I have absolutely nothing from Australia. Skulls of the natives there would be very important to us. Müller responded enthusiastically, sending multiple consignments of anthropological, botanical, ethnographic, geological and zoological specimens in 1866 and 1867. In accordance with Renard's request, he sent 2 complete skeletons of a man and a woman from the tribe inhabiting the Murray Desert and several other separated bones. He also forwarded some fruit of Banksia serrata, a newly discovered species of cassowary, a series of photographic portraits of all the remaining individuals of the Yarra race, weapons of the Yarra tribe, the natives of Arnhem Land and the natives of the Murray River, ethnographic objects from the natives of Rockingham Bay, a bark painting made by a young black native of the Yarra tribe, a sample of diatomaceous earth, and an extensive collection of molluscs and seeds. Müller's surviving correspondence contains little detail about how these items were acquired, but the photographic portraits have been identified as a known series of photographs of residents of Corranderk Aboriginal Station near Melbourne, taken in the 1860s by Charles Walter, a German immigrant employed by Müller primarily as a botanical collector. And if that's a topic of interest, I would strongly recommend Jane Lyden's Eye Contact. It's quite eye-opening. Most of the items that I've just described that Müller sent to Moscow actually arrived too late to be exhibited at the All Russia Ethnographical Exhibition, but some of them, including the photographic portraits, were exhibited at another World's Fair in Moscow, the Anthropological Exhibition of 1879. This exhibition also featured mannequins, busts and masks made by the Russian sculptor Ivan Sevryugin, some of which depicted Pacific Islanders, Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples, and mainland Australian Aboriginal peoples. Sevryugin drew inspiration from busts held in the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, including copies of Benjamin Law's 1835 to 36 busts of Wiradjuri, quote, an Aboriginal chief of Van Diemen's Land, and his wife Truganini, which were commissioned by George Augustus Robinson and are considered the earliest major pieces of Australian sculpture. I haven't shown them here because I understand there's some sensitivities within the Tasmanian Aboriginal community about the existence of these busts. Sevryugin also drew inspiration from lithographs published in 1847 by British naturalist and painter George French Angus under the title South Australia Illustrated, in particular for the mannequins. These were displayed as a sort of diorama, supposedly depicting the typical Aboriginal way of life, but made grotesquely fantastical by the use of conifers as a backdrop, presumably because eucalypts or other Australian species were in short supply in Russia, but it's very weird. It's very weird. The anthropological exhibition of 1879 was visited by a number of prominent French anthropologists, and due to the exhibition's success and Bogdanov's promotion of craniological studies, Moscow University became a centre of anthropological thought and collecting from the 1870s onward. In contrast to the more academically secluded St. Petersburg, anthropological endeavours in Moscow enjoyed broad interest and support. Some of the items exhibited in 1879 can no longer be traced, and sadly at this stage that includes the ancestral remains. But the artefacts and the bark paintings sent by Müller are now thought to be held in the Museum of Anthropology of Moscow State University, as are the busts of Waredi and Truganini. I'm afraid that's all I have time for. Maybe I shouldn't be sorry about that. I really only begun to scratch the surface of this topic. I haven't even mentioned Nikolai Mikluha-Mackay, a Russian naturalist and anthropologist who spent a total of 14 years in Australia and the Pacific region and is considered a pioneer of the modern fieldwork tradition in anthropology. But quite a bit has been written about him already, and I guess I wanted to highlight some of the lesser known individuals and institutions exemplifying Russian scholarly interest in human physical and cultural diversity in Australia and the Pacific during the long 19th century. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Hilary, for an exemplary, wide-ranging, empirically dense lecture that has opened a whole new field of scholarship to, I'm sure, many of us here, certainly to me. We now have roughly 20 minutes for questions. If you're online, do please use the Q&A function through Zoom to pose your question, and I will relay those questions to the audience in the theatre. For those of you in the room, Professor Goodman has very kindly agreed to be the roving mic manager, but because of the sound quality of the mic, I will actually have to restate the questions. So I hope I don't mess that up, but also if you could keep your questions kind of nice, precise and brief, that will help us in relaying to the Zoom audience. So who would like to kick off the question time? While you gather your thoughts, no, Oleg, please.
Do we have the mic? I can just amplify.
Yeah, sure, and then I'll speak into the mic.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. So I do understand that the topic is more or less in the 19th century, but do you know anything about the early 20th century, specifically what happened to those studies and collections, say, during and after the Russian Revolution of 1917?
So the question is about the continuation of these kinds of studies and the later history of these collections, particularly in the wake of the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century.
I think it's a very important question, but unfortunately it's not really within the scope of my study. I suspect some work has been done on it. Mostly it would have been published in Russian, and Yelena Gova would be more familiar with it than I am, but there are still publications emerging about the history of some of the specific collections in particular, not perhaps links between institutions, but kind of, what would you call like anniversary studies, and so and so many 100 years since the foundation of the Kunstkammer, for example. And some of those are quite informative, but yeah, I'm afraid I'm not really able to say for it. I mean, really, in a way, it's remarkable how much is still in some of those major collections, how much hasn't gone missing. And with the Kunstkammer, quite a lot of their collection items have been digitised, so you can search the collection online's database in Russian or in English, although the results tend to be better if you search in Russian. But, it's actually, you get quite a good impression of what is there. Yeah.
Thank you. So one of the things that I really enjoyed was how you traced the lineage of various different physical objects, right? Drawings that go to sculptures, that go to photographs, etc. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to how over the 19th century, as changing technology comes into play for this process, if that affects how these images are captured, or if that kind of hastens the ubiquity of certain images being more seen as kind of normative.
So the question is about a media history and the transformations of the 19th century and the way the changes in media may have altered the dissemination and reception of these objects in collections.
Again, I mean, it's a very good question and one I don't feel terribly well qualified to answer, but I mean, I think part of what's interesting is that you do see images being reused and reused again and reused again. They might be, I mean, they're used from a whole range of different publications from different expeditions, different nationalities. You know, the French expeditions, for example, are a really big source of illustrations in particular that are then kind of repurposed into other forms. And whether that's other two-dimensional forms. I mean, even with, there's even a sort of a repurposing going on from the artist's sketches on board some of those early voyages to the published versions of the sketches. And if you, there's been some interesting work done, particularly by Elena, but also by other people on comparing those, and they can be quite different. And I mean, perhaps it's a bit of a stretch to say this across the board, but there does seem to be a bit of a, maybe the more often something has been removed from its original context, the more it tends to harden and tends to be simplified and tends to perhaps correspond to what people are assuming that someone from this particular country or you know, part of the world ought to look like. I'm not sure whether that was really an answer to your, I mean, the photography is not something that I've seen. I mean, apart from the one I showed right at the end, I mean, it really only sort of becomes at all evident in Russian anthropological study towards the end of the period that I'm interested in. And I think, I mean, this would probably be something that ties in with Oleg's question about, you know, the early part of the 20th century and post-Russian Revolution, because that would be when you would be getting this sort of huge explosion in photographic technologies and ability to easily reproduce images. But that's not something that I've focused on to quite the same extent.
Julia.
Thank you so much for this talk. And I guess you started at the beginning by talking about how, in some senses, Russian interest in human taxonomy and racial science comes from diversity within the early Russian Empire. So I'm wondering if there is something specific here about how this creation of racial science and racial knowledge is informing like Russian imperial policy and Russian imperial thinking. Obviously, this is something that all good empires are doing at the time, but does that play out differently in the Russian context?
I think it absolutely is. And there was a very good publication which came out only a couple of years ago, which again I stupidly didn't list here, but it was looking at, it was called The White Tsar's Burden. And it was looking at basically exactly that in relation, so Russian ideas about human diversity and how that fed into Russia's attempts to control Central Asia. So the Stans, for example, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, those areas. I mean, I guess what I found interesting about that particular case study was that really there were a lot of similarities in the way the Russian Empire was sort of responding to these colonized peoples. I mean, there are differences, and I think those are partly because it's a landlocked empire, so you don't have that sort of enormous body of water separating the metropole from the colonies. But really, it was the similarities that struck me. I think the only really obvious difference that I can remember being pointed out between Western European colonizer or sort of colonial thought and Russian colonial thought was that in the case of France or Great Britain or even Germany, there's this sort of very masculinist perspective on perspective of the empire as a sort of a male persona, and a sort of a feminization often of colonized peoples as being weak and lesser. And that doesn't seem to happen in the Russian Empire. And the author's suggestion in that case was that that was partly because there was such a strong sense of Russia as being feminine, of Mother Russia, that this was, you know, not an appropriate lens through which to also be viewing your colonized peoples. Yeah, unfortunately, that book is only available in German, but I'm hoping a translation will come out. It's a really good read.
We have an online question, which I'll read out for you, Hilary. How unusual or not is Russian anthropology when it comes to the role played by reflection on internal human diversity within its territories, compared, for example, Britain or Germany? Does the prominence of Baltic German speakers play any role here? Are they ever seen as having innate or anthropological differences from other Russians?
Oh, that's a great question too. I have wondered that myself about Baltic Germans. I haven't found any evidence of it. Perhaps because they tended to be the ones doing the theorising. You know, I don't know that there was nothing of that kind going on, but I can't name any concrete examples. And I suppose, as I just mentioned, you know, Russia as a land-based empire perhaps was a little bit less able to make really easy distinctions between, you know, who was Russian and who wasn't Russian. So that, I mean, I believe to some extent the divisions were initially more around religious belief, in which case the Baltic Germans would generally have been hived off as being Lutheran or Protestant rather than Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. But also around language, I think that plays perhaps a larger role in the Russian case than it does or did in the case of some of the Western European colonial settings. So, you know, this idea of inhabiting is, I'm going to get this wrong, inhabiting is people who...
Aliens.
Inhabiting.
That's like aliens in terms of religion.
Yeah, so that's the religious aliens, and the inhabiting was, I believe, like from memory, that was more applied to people who didn't speak Russian. At least like during a particular period. I presume it's not used that way today, but...
Well, the general, if I can,
yeah, please.
answer this question a little bit. I think in general I think in general your line of thought is absolutely correct. The actual division was not so much ethnic or racial, but by religion. And then there is another connected question of how many of those Germans actually converted into Russian Christianity.
I don't know, but it would be interesting to find out.
It's out there.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
What's the Russian impulse that people were talking about? Was it a collective impulse, or are they motivated by participation in the bigger theoretical debates at the time about diffusion, degradation, evolution, and stuff?
I think both. Really, I mean, I imagine there are some who are more interested in just acquisition and some who are more interested in theorising. And probably the examples that I've tended to quote are the people who are more interested in the theoretical questions, because they're the people who are kind of generating publications. And that's so, I mean, I guess that's a sort of circular sense of intellectual history, that the people you end up talking about are the people who are producing the material that you can study, but they're not necessarily representative of the larger corpus. I mean, I think crew members on some of the Russian expeditions had absolutely no interest in theoretical questions of degradation. I mean, maybe some of them did, but generally, like on those early expeditions, it really seemed to be a case of, no, this is new, this is different. This would be a great souvenir for my girlfriend, for my wife, for my, my colleague, or I mean, in Müller's case, Ferdinand von Müller, and he doesn't seem to have had any interest in physical anthropology or any interest in human diversity. He was a botanist. And the closest I've got to understanding his motivation is this, the article that I cite by A.M. Lucas, who talks about zoological specimens, but it's very relevant to ancestral remains, that really what Müller was trying to do with sending items to contacts overseas was to sort of to gain recognition and he seems to have had a really deep-seated sense of not inferiority, maybe insecurity, or that his work hadn't been recognised within the colony of Victoria as it should have been. And so he seems to have tried to reach out beyond Victoria to sort of obtain recognition, obtain honours, obtain membership of prestigious societies, and that the specimens are his currency to purchase that.
Question from
You were right, pen did explode.
Thank you very much, Louise. Just a follow-up on Mueller.
Yes.
The artefacts he sends are from Yarra, the Murray and Arnhem Land.
Yes.
And so I wondered why those, is it just what he had access to there, or does he have a sense that there are some differences in this, ends up as an Australian exhibition? Does he have a sense of difference in that group? Or?
Again, that's a good question. And in this case, it's hard to answer because he writes so little about his motivation. I mean, it tends to be the case that someone like Renard will write and say, we would like something from Australia. And then, I mean, as far as I can make it out from what's left of his correspondence, and there's very, very little, I mean, there's not a Muller archive as such, but the Correspondence of Ferdinand von Muller project at the Botanical Gardens in Melbourne has put together an enormous database of letters that are sort of held in a whole range of archives worldwide. And so from them, you get a bit of a sense that he then, someone says, I would like, broadly such and such, and he then goes to his network of collectors, someone he thinks might have access to something that would be interesting, and says, look, can you get me? I mean, we do have one letter where that basically says, Dr. So-and-so has asked me for some skulls of natives from New Zealand. Can you get me some? And this is someone who's based in Auckland, I think. So I suspect that's what was going on there. I just can't, I mean, I'd really love to know whether he ever thought about differences between different Aboriginal nations, but it hasn't been possible to get any sense of that yet.
We have another couple of questions coming in online. The first is, you mentioned the narrow-minded Swiss pastor who chased
yes.
It was a bear away from
Yes, it was. Yes.
Is there documented resistance to collecting within Russia? And I'm curious, was this shaped at all by any denominational or theological differences, for example, between Protestants and Orthodox figures?
I haven't come across any. I mean, in a way, it wouldn't surprise me. I think with someone like Nikolai von Maclay, there is, whom I only mentioned very briefly, there is a bit of a sense that what he was doing and what his kind of fellow collectors were doing was a bit on the nose, like a bit sort of risque, a bit pushing the boundaries of polite society. And I mean, certainly that's, you see in, I mean, it's not quite an answer to your exact question, or that exact question, but you see in Australia, certainly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people objecting to the removal of their ancestors' remains, but also you see non-Aboriginal people. There are a couple of really high-profile cases of well-known Aboriginal figures who were very popular. One in Adelaide, Tommy Walker, and one in Tasmania, William Lanny, who was believed to be the last full-blooded Tasmanian man. And when it became known that in each case a local anatomist had basically divided them up on the morgue table and buried something that wasn't their body to pretend that they'd been giving a decent burial, there was a huge outcry. Huge. I mean, it was partly for religious reasons, but it was also just basic decency. I think there was a real recognition that it doesn't matter what, what ethnicity you are, what language you speak, this is not okay, this is not the way to treat. Some of the people also who objected within Australia to grave robbing, for example, were missionaries. But on the other hand, some of the people who collected ancestral remains were missionaries. So, maybe you can't draw too many conclusions from that.
In fact, that's in part answered the next question, but I'll pose it anyway unless it prompts anything further. is there any indication from Indigenous communities that they knew specimens were being removed and taken? Were the specimens removed with ease, secrecy?
In as much as we know, and I mean, you know, for some of the cases that I mentioned, we just don't know enough. But like for Muller, for example, because I don't even know from whom he obtained those remains. But absolutely, I mean, there are an enormous number of cases where either you have a collector writing, you know, and I stole out in the dead of night with an armed guard to take these skulls because I knew that I was going to be killed if someone found out what I was doing. And I knew that they didn't like it, and, you know, this would be very sacrilegious, but science is basically the argument they run with. And there are also well-documented examples of active resistance when, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people found out what was going on and were very angry about it. So yes, absolutely is the short answer.
Terrific. Well, I think we've worked, Hillary, quite hard in questions so far. So unless there are any very pressing other questions, I'd now like to invite a colleague, Professor Mark Eagler, the Hanson Professor of History and the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Arts, to offer a vote of thanks to close proceedings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hillary. That was a very wide-ranging and deep dive into the history of the Russian involvement with what would become, on the one hand, racial science and scientific racism, and on the other hand, anthropology, and this very strong involvement of Russian and German Russian and German French Russian scholars in this history. Russia, of course, is in the news these days for all the wrong reasons, and any hope one might have had to return these remains is, for the moment at least, for the foreseeable future, off the table, I fear. Your lecture has also reminded us, though, that Russia, in the context of, you know, why it is in the news at the moment, we get presented sometimes, maybe I spend too much time on Twitter, and so everything is sort of extremely polarized as a result. But we're presented on the one hand with a narrative of Russia as an extraordinary, benevolent kind of empire, quite different from the other European empires. And that somehow, therefore, because it was a multi-ethnic, a multinational empire where the elite was also multinational, multi-linguistic, and so on, as you've pointed out. And then therefore, somehow, this neo-imperialism we're seeing today is somehow not real imperialism. And on the other hand, we get the old story of, you know, Russia as being extraordinarily bad and completely different from Western civilization and so on. I think your lecture has reminded us on several occasions, as you went through your text, that Russia was a deeply European empire. It was completely normal. It did what European empires do. They went explore, they went conquer, and they went steal skulls. And the Russians were no different from anybody else. And they were also deeply involved in European culture at the time, which of course meant to be involved in discussions about scientific racism and so on. So I found that very helpful to be reminded of this kind of very deep involvement of Russia in all of these processes and in our region. So thank you very much, and please thank our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, everyone.